could be obtained. They decided the price should be 130 pence, paid in 3 instalments. The first would be 50 pence. 2 million people rushed to buy and overnight doubled the number of private shareholders in Britain, just as the government hoped. On the first day of trading, the share price shot up. The whole thing was seen as a brilliant success.
I think it was a resounding success for a number of reasons. It succeeded in bringing very large numbers of private investors into direct share ownership, which they had not done before. It showed that the British financial markets are capable of organising a worldwide sale, that we don't have to play second fiddle to the foreigners, or whatever market. The government achieved its political objectives, and it set a pattern which subsequent privatisations will follow, and they will capitalise on our success, I believe.
If you sell £10 notes for £5, it's not surprising that the sale of them turns out to be a great success. There's not too much scope for self-congratulation there.
Financial experts like Dr. Kay, even though they agree with privatisation, believe the government lost billions of pounds because of the way it sold Telecom. They say this is because the value of the shares doubled after the government had sold them. Within hours, shares the government sold for 50 pence were worth 93.
3 billion shares were sold for 43p less than they were subsequently proven to be worth.
What do you estimate was the total cost to the country of the sale of British Telecom?
We estimated that the total costs amounted to something of the order of £1.5 billion. That's perhaps quite a conservative estimate.
That was how much money the government lost on the first day after selling the shares. But the real position is worse, because in subsequent weeks, the shares became even more valuable.
If one takes account of that subsequent movement, then one comes up with the higher estimate of the total underpricing. That's to say, the 3 billion figure.
Is it actually fair to take account of that movement over a period of months?
What one can say is that at the time of the issue, the market might not have had all of the information on which to value British Telecom accurately, so that the subsequent valuation, once the market had settled down, gave a better indication of what the assets were truly worth.
So if Telecom shares had been sold for their real worth, say critics, the government would have received up to £3 billion more, money that could have benefited us all.
Well, £3 billion is a huge figure. For example, it's about what the Channel Tunnel is likely to cost. Or you could think of it in terms of other government capital spending. It would buy you rather a lot of schools or hospitals.
We're talking about at least 30 moderately sized hospitals that could have been built with that money. Or if we take our upper limit, then we're talking about 60 or 70 hospitals.
According to these critics, it's money that need never have been lost. There had been plenty of warnings. When the Conservatives were returned to power in 1979, the selling off of nationalised industries had barely been mentioned in their election manifesto, although they brought with them a deep distrust of state enterprises. As Sir Keith Joseph recalled later,
"We came to office convinced that the structure of the nationalised industries contributed to the national malaise."
the privatisation programme started with the selling of companies which the government felt had no place in the public sector, companies like BP and British Aerospace. The sale of the first dozen companies attracted a lot of attention, but didn't compare with the plan to sell Telecom. But even by the time the Telecom sale was announced in 1982, clear problems had emerged about the way these industries were being sold. The biggest lesson was that many of the early sales had been seriously underpriced, and for those who managed to get the shares, there was a quick killing to be made. People who bought shares in British Aerospace were able to resell them straight away at a profit of 14%. Those who bought cable and wireless were able to sell at a profit of 18%. British Port shares were sold at a profit of 23%. And Amersham International, a former subsidiary of the Atomic Energy Authority, resold at a 32% profit. In fact, the Amersham offer in 1982 was so cheap, there was a disturbance on the floor of the stock exchange. The next day, as the city celebrated its good fortune, there were growing questions as to why Amersham had been so underpriced. That concern brought calls for an immediate investigation.
Undoubtedly, there must be an inquiry. It's very easy to set a price too low, and we must make sure such a mistake doesn't occur again.
That inquiry was carried out by the influential Public Accounts Committee. It concluded that public assets were being sold too cheaply, and it criticized the method used to sell them. And they were worried about what might happen with the much larger sale of Telecom.
When you're selling something for 50 millions, 100 millions, whatever it might be, and you get it wrong, okay, there's a few millions, and deplorable this is, but it's limited. When you're selling something for thousands of millions, 5,000 million pounds, obviously any slight error is an enormous loss to the taxpayer. And so you have to look at it quite differently.
Did the government take heed of those points when it came to sell BT?
Not much, not much.
We will therefore take the earliest opportunity to introduce legislation which, while keeping BT as a single enterprise...
It was Patrick Jenkins, Secretary of State for Industry, who announced the sale in the middle of 1982. According to their critics, the Treasury and the Department of Trade, the ministries responsible, made two key mistakes in the way they planned to sell Telecom. The first was the decision to sell all the shares in one go, a big risk with something so difficult to price.
The obvious thing that the government should have done is to have tried to test out the market beforehand. That's to say, before you leap into the bathwater, you put your hand in. And that well-established principle could easily have been applied to the British Telecom issue.
The other key mistake made by the Treasury and the Department of Trade in selling Telecom, say their critics, was to rely on the city to price it for them. It was asking for trouble, they say, because it was the city which would be buying most of the shares.
The problem is that the people you ask for advice as to the price that you're going to charge for your assets are the people who are going to buy them. They are the underwriters or the merchant banks, and they're going to buy, and they're the people who advise you on the price. It's like, you know, when you sell a house, you go along to an estate agent, and he advises you at the price that you should put it on the market for. That would be a terrible thing if that estate agent was the buyer.
By the time the city came to sell Telecom, the controversial outcome is said to have been almost inevitable. However hard the government's advisors, headed by Kleinwort Benson, tried to get a fair price, the system would thwart them. There were too many conflicting interests at stake, and they were apparent right from the beginning. Early in 1984, 9 months before the sale, it looked as if Telecom would fetch a very low price, and government advisors admit the major problem was the attitude of the city itself.
You wouldn't call it warm. I think that's the best way you could describe it. They remained to be convinced. That's certainly the fairest way to put it. They were naturally concerned that there wouldn't be pressure on them to buy either a bad investment or an investment at the wrong price. Media coverage at the time was hardly encouraging, was it? I wasn't suggesting that either the sale or the company were anything to write home about.
I think they were very lukewarm. And some were even hostile to the whole thing. They were frightened of the funding burden, because after all, this hadn't been done before, and they felt that they were expected to take the lot at this stage. So lukewarm, very negative towards the sale.
Dr. Karen Newman probably knows more about the selling of British Telecom than other outsiders. She's just spent 2 years piecing together the inside story for a book, parts of which the city tried to suppress.
They knew nothing about BT, except from personal experience. So very negative feelings towards BT, based, if you like, on ignorance and personal dealings with the company. And that is not what you make an investment decision on.
But in the middle of 1984, 6 months before the sale, there came the first real indication that the city was undervaluing British Telecom. That summer, 3 of the stockbrokers advising the government brought out detailed reports on the company's prospects. These predicted that Telecom was perhaps a good investment.
It actually gave people numbers to play with. Rather than airy-fairy concepts, it meant that here was something where people could quantify the profits that could be expected.
So British Telecom started looking more attractive?
Well, it wasn't more attractive because there wasn't any basis of information before. It began to look like a serious investment. One that one would want to have in one's portfolio to some measure, even if it wasn't being sold that year.
But even these reports were still far too pessimistic, according to another firm of city stockbrokers, Fieldings. From the late summer of 1984, they were warning their clients that Telecom was going to be one of the brightest investment prospects that year, and that the city was seriously underestimating its potential.
Do you know how the rest of the city reacted to Fielding's attitude?
Well, I was told that they did receive a lot of phone calls suggesting that they ought to pipe down, perhaps, and perhaps not rock the boat. People were displeased by these maverick suggestions. And in fact, in a sense, Fieldings are talking the price up, which is the last thing that the city appears to have wanted.
Parliament made it possible for the people of the United Kingdom to own British Telecom shares.
Whatever arguments there were in the city about Telecom's potential, it was from this period onwards, September 1984, that even the rest of the world started to recognize that Telecom was going to be a great investment.
Anyone who wants to can apply for
The public, now being blitzed by the huge advertising campaign, were beginning to show signs of substantial interest. It was an interest reflected increasingly in the newspapers in a series of more and more optimistic headlines. That growing public interest was clearly picked up in a series of detailed studies carried out by the Mori organization for the government's city advisors in the months before the sale.
If you look just at the certain to buy, we had about 600,000 in August. We had 750,000 in the beginning of September, 1.1 million in the end of September, rising to 1.2 million at the beginning of November. And then at the end of November, when the shares were actually floated, that rose up to just over 3 million people.
But in the city, the government's advisors didn't take this sort of evidence seriously when working out the price.
If you had seen, as I imagine you have, the detailed Mori findings, you would find that the turning point, which the number of applicants declined, showing that their responses was a relatively small amount of money. It all comes back to not the qualitative thing about there is demand. Of course there is demand. With no demand, you can't do a 4 billion issue.
Something like 500,000 people thinking of investing £500. And this is before you get the offer campaign. And just before the flotation, 3.3 million people wish to buy shares and are willing to invest £900.
How do you think the city and the government should have responded to the market research?
I think if they had responded, we would have seen a higher price for BT shares.
But it wasn't just the public who were now getting very interested. By this stage, 6 weeks before the sale, when the first prospectus was published, there were signs that many big city investors were also well aware there was a killing to be made. It was a fact recognized by the chairman of Merrill Lynch Europe, one of the city's most powerful men.
What was your feeling about British Telecom 6-8 weeks before it was floated?
In terms of its potential success, I think it was fairly evident that it was likely to be a so-called hot issue, that it would be very comfortably oversubscribed. I think it was clear that there was considerable excitement about it and that there was likely to be a very heavy demand.
Demand by this time, early November, a month before the sale, was also flooding in from American investors, eager to get their hands on this hot number. Yet in the city, although the price had been pushed up, many investors knew it was still grossly underpriced. When the price was set on November the 16th, 2 weeks before the sale, it was only 130 pence. That was the price which the financial press had been suggesting sometime before the stampede for shares had begun. On the day that the price was fixed, Fieldings, the stockbrokers who'd argued throughout that the assessment was unrealistic, told their clients the price was 30% too low and calculated that investors' earnings would be 50% above average, or 3 times that of other growth companies.
It is incredible for a government and for a city which believes in market forces not to respond to what is obviously marketing forces at work. I mean, here we have a classic example of demand suddenly exceeding supply, which was in fact the object of the marketing campaign, to change people's perceptions from superabundance to scarcity.
The eventual price was the top of the range that had ever been discussed among the advisors. I don't think the demand was ignored. The pricing decision was being made in a slightly new environment. To that extent, there may have been a degree of conservatism. I wouldn't go beyond that.
But at 130 pence, it immediately became clear the public wanted to buy far more shares than there were shares to buy. The government, to try and spread them widely, had placed a strict limit of 800 shares per person. Even with this limit, it was feared a ballot might have to be held, and a decision was actually made to dampen down demand. The telephone number of the Telecom Information Office in Bristol, a feature of all previous advertising, suddenly disappeared. And this is the television commercial you never saw. They thought the response to this one would finally swamp them.
The time has come to decide whether you're going to share in British Telecom's future. The prospectus containing details of the offer and an application form is in banks, post offices and in most national newspapers. But time is short. The last date for receipt of applications is Wednesday, the 28th of November, British Telecom Day.
It was all very different from the pessimistic judgment of a few months before. As the doors closed on the offer, there followed the clearest indication of all that everybody knew the share price was too low. Thousands of people inside and outside the city set about getting round the government's limit of 800 shares per person.
Their techniques range from the very naive to the very sophisticated. The naive ones merely draw a very large number of checks on the same bank account. I'm not really disposed to talk about the more sophisticated ones because who knows, this may well be the forerunner of a number of such exercises.
And excessive numbers of shares were acquired by individuals in other ways. Many of those allocated to the merchant bank, Singer and Friedlander, were purchased by senior executives. Chief Executive Anthony Solomons, who bought 50,000 shares himself, later admitted it had been an error of judgment. The stock exchange itself found that another millionaire, city businessman Sir Philip Harris, acquired not 800 British Telecom shares, but 237,000. He's adamant, though, he did nothing improper. Just how lucrative the sale was is now history. And not only for British investors. Americans alone made almost £250 million in a few hours.
Everybody literally was euphoric. And then shortly afterwards, I think a reaction set in amongst some city people, not all of them, because, I mean, a lot of them were still very, very happy with the amount of money they'd made out of the shares. But I did talk to a few people in the city, and one was actually sickened by the greed. I had another person actually crying on my shoulder. The same person who actually told me I would double my money on BT shares in the early summer. He told me this, and a week within the flotation and the tremendous success, he was crying on my shoulder, very upset at the very success. I mean, his words were something like, I've created a monster.
I'm sure if you talk to enough people, some of them will tell you they think it was underpriced. If you take a sample of any group of people, you'll find some who think it was underpriced, and the majority think it was resounding success. I think it was resounding success, and the price was set at a level to guarantee success.
However brave a face the city puts on what happened, there is in fact widespread embarrassment, as Dr. Newman found when she finished her research.
They were sensitive about the underpricing. They were sensitive about the fees that were given to the city experts. In fact, I was very, very surprised indeed, because they were matters of fact. They couldn't be altered and changed, and yet when it came to the book manuscript, they wanted things changed.
One point of embarrassment was the fees the city charged for underwriting the shares, that is, guaranteeing to buy them if they remained unsold.
The underwriting fees on the 16th of November, when you know there's tremendous demand, the underwriting fees are 1.5% instead of the normal of 1.25%. And that combined with a promise that you will get 55% of the shares you underwrite at a time when everybody wants these shares. The whole, all the way, you see everything, in a sense, working in the city's favour.
Were there not great risks?
Yes, there were. I mean, in spring, there were tremendous risks. It was unbelievable that you could sell the 3 billion shares. But when the city actually comes to do its work in the summer and in the autumn, there's going to be no difficulty in selling these shares.
Many critics think that the method used by the city to sell state industries like telecom is wholly inadequate. For instance, unlike America, the city has no good way of measuring demand before they set a price.
They don't have the tools to determine the real level of demand, and therefore to measure the supply-demand equation and come up with an accurate price. So they tend to try and guess or estimate where the price might be once the shares actually begin to trade. And then they apply a discount in order to allow for the fact that it's a very large volume, so there has to be something of a volume discount, and to have a margin of safety so that the issue does not fail. And that tends, in more cases than none, than others, to produce a price which is too low.
You don't think it's the best way to sell huge national state industries?
Definitely not.
But there are others we spoke to, while accepting much of this, who believe the root cause of what happened to British Telecom is that the city has become too good at protecting its own interests.
Well, the trouble is, you see, that the underwriters, the merchant banks as well, they were the people that were advising you on the price, and they were the people that stood to make the most if the price was cheap, because they would obviously resell at a much higher price. And so there is clearly a conflict of interest there, and what we really wanted, what we really should have, is the situation where the government has an independent source of advice, and that we felt was lacking.
Yet whatever the cause, the consequences are the same.
People who got their maximum allocation made an overnight capital gain of something in the region of £300 to £400. Now, if you ask, where did they get that £300 or £400 from, then the answer is it came from the rest of the population who didn't buy BT shares, who will, forever afterwards, in effect, have to pay slightly higher taxes as a result, in order to pay for that particular capital gain for the group of BT shareholders.
And that's the vast majority of the population.
And that's the vast majority of the population, that's right.
This autumn, the government intends to sell the British Gas Corporation in much the same way as it sold Telecom, but there will be one difference.
British Telecom is the largest sale that's ever been observed on the London stock market, or indeed anywhere in the world. Now, the British Gas is going to be perhaps 2 to 3 times as large as that. So we're talking about vast sums.
But it's not only British Gas that will be sold. After that, there are plans to sell British Airways, British Leyland, the National Bus Company, British Steel, the water boards, electricity, and even the airports. All will be sold off.
Over the next few years, the government reckons that it's going to be selling between £4 and £5 billion worth of assets per year. Just imagine making the sort of mistakes that were associated with British Telecom, with those issues. And you're talking about losses of perhaps £3 billion per annum.